Welcome to We All Serve, the podcast featuring leadership lessons from and conversations with those veterans that have served in the United States Armed Forces. Meet your hosts, Robert Lewis, a proud enlisted veteran that served active duty in the United States Marine Corps. Hoorah! And Shalom Klein, who is privileged to be an officer in the United States Army Reserve. Hoorah! They both agree. We all serve.
Well, welcome back to yet another episode of the We All Serve podcast. We're already on episode number 14. So as we were just talking about, just before coming on, it means I guess we've been doing this for a couple of months. So now I think we're on a roll. Robert, there's no turning back. We've had some awesome episodes, and today's is a real treat. So, Robert, my brother, my friends, how you doing?
Doing well, my friend, my brother. I am had a great day. It's starting out a great week, and as you just said, we have another great guest. I think as this podcast continues to move forward, I'm tempted to call it a show. But it is truly because, it's all the feedback that I get. A lot of people are saying, wow, you guys have a great show. That's a
milestone. That's a milestone. I called myself the other day calling this a pod, which I think just sounds really cool. I think it means podcast. It's almost too long. Let's abbreviate it. We're going on the pod tomorrow. I kind of like it.
It puts a little twist on it.
Yeah.
And I like that. I like that. So, this is going to be great, man. I'm excited to talk to our guest today, another guy who has a resume that, really blows me away, that so much experience, so many different things that he's been able to do that I think our audience will gain a lot of information and also really enjoy what he has to share.
I'll admit that I don't think, now that we are officially a show, I don't think I will ever forget the moment. I think it was 2 episodes ago where you put our own guest to sleep by reading his bio. You just went on and I think we had to shout out at the screen and say hello, are you still there? And we were talking about him, which was funny. So
that is funny, yeah.
But all of our guests have been so accomplished. So they have a long bio, which is exciting. So Robert, I know I could always count on you. Before we bring in our guests, you always know what's going on in the world. I know certainly the highlight, everybody's talking about it, everybody will continue to talk about, is certainly the passing of the notorious RBG.
Yep. Yeah. Just groundbreaking in her own right. Really universally loved. I think I even heard the president say he was sad to hear of her passing. So yes, rest in peace, I think is appropriate to RBG, and I don't think we'll never see another like her.
Absolutely. And I do want to mention that I'm biased over here, but up in my neck of the woods, up in Skokie, we've got the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, and they have been running an exhibit called the Notorious RBG, fascinating education about the work that she has done in fighting for women's rights and really, a legend as female Jewish justice of the Supreme Court. And they've been running this exhibit, and now I just saw the Chicago Tribune ran a piece saying that the Holocaust Museum is actually becoming the site for the Midwest, where a lot of officials and elected officials are coming by to lay their tributes. So I highly recommend. I actually just saw that. I think they're going to do something virtual as well. So check that out. So that's big news.
No, that's great. I'd love to check it out myself. So absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, it's perfect segue, I believe, for our guest today, who, as you'll be introducing here soon. I'm really excited to learn about all of the different, posts that he has commanded. So that kind of just to give you an idea of the exclusivity that our guest has today.
Absolutely. No, a long time coming. Excited to bring in our guests. So without further ado, certainly an honor to bring in retired Major General Jeff Jacobs. There he is, right there on the screen. And General Jacobs was commissioned in the United States Army as an infantry officer from West Point, the United States Military Academy, in 1979, after serving for 7 years on active duty in the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He then commanded a rifle company in the 4th Battalion, 187th Infantry Regiment for nearly 2 years, and deployed for 6 months to the Sinai Peninsula. Again, a lot to share, but in the Army Reserve, General Jacobs served in a variety of command and staff assignments as an infantry and civil affairs officer, commanded an institutional training battalion in the 108th Division at Fort Jackson, which I know we'll hear a lot about Fort Jackson throughout this conversation, and twice actually commanded brigade-level units, mobilized 3 times, and was the operations officer of the Humanitarian Assistance Coordination Center of Combined Joint Task Force 190 in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. Served in Bosnia in 1996 during Operation Joint Endeavor as a civil affairs plan officer in the G3, which to those unfamiliar is the operations and plan section of the Allied Company Europe Rapid Reactions Corps, and as the operations officer of the Joint Election Operations Center, helping to coordinate the first free elections in Bosnia. Served active duty for over 2.5 years during Operation Noble Eagle and Iraqi Freedom as commanders of different units, first at Fort Bragg and then in Iraq. From 2005 through 2008, Major General Jacobs served as the commanding general of the 350th Civil Affairs Command, headquartered in Pensacola, Florida. Served as the commander of the Contingency Command Post of United States Army North, 5th Army at Fort Sam Houston, Texas, through 2011. And deployed the command post in support of civil authorities for Hurricanes Gustav and Ike in 2008, Hurricane Irene in 2011, and most recently, General Jacobs recently served as the commanding general of the United States Army Civil Affairs and Psychological Operations Command, Airborne, headquartered in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, until his retirement in 2014. Major General Jacobs holds a Bachelor of Science degree from West Point, a Juris Doctor degree from Georgetown University Law Center, and a Master of Strategic Studies degree from the United States Army War College. His decorations include the Distinguished Service Medal and the Legion of Merit, 3 awards. He earned the Master Parachutist badge and the Ranger tab, among several other badges. He's a published author on many topics relating to service, retired civilian attorney, and continues to serve as a United States Army Reserve ambassador in South Carolina. So it's such a privilege to have Major General retired Jeff Jacobs. General Jacobs, thank you so much for joining us on We All Serve, sir. Appreciate you coming on.
Well, thanks for having me, and thanks for that kind introduction. I wish my parents could have heard it. My dad would have enjoyed it, and my mom would have believed it.
You know what? They've got a lot to your family, your wife, your kids. Everybody has a lot to be proud of all that you have done. And you know what? I mean it. The last thing that I said is perhaps the thing that's most relevant to our listeners. Certainly, you've held a lot of different posts, a lot of different commands, but you haven't viewed it as something in the past, and now it's time to take a well-deserved vacation, which I think, some could argue you certainly deserve. You've continued to do quite a bit. So welcome, and I will take a moment to say to those that are celebrating from among our faith a Shana Tova, a Happy New Year, and I could say that to you, General Jacobs. So great to have you. I just to get started, we talked a lot about your military experience. We don't know a lot about your sort of family background and what led you to head out to West Point back in the 70s and start off with this crazy life that has led you to so many different countries.
Well, my dad is a retired colonel. He was a career Army officer. So both my parents, and my mother just passed away recently, but both my parents were born and raised in Los Angeles, California. And my dad graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA, in their ROTC program, and spent 21 years on active duty in the Army. Is a Vietnam veteran. And so I grew up on Army posts all over the place. And that kind of led me toward the Army as a way of life when I was in high school. And my mom used to tell the story about talking to me when I was 16 and saying, well, you'd better start thinking about where you're going to college. And she said that I responded, well, I'm going to West Point, and that was it. So, and I was fortunate enough to get a nomination and an appointment, and the rest is history.
Wow. And I'm looking at, some of the experience that you have here, General, and, what I'm interested in is, what is it like to, as a general, as I was enlisted in the Marine Corps. So I'm surprised that Shalom didn't mention that to you. But oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But, I'm really just wondering, what is it like to command a battalion? What is it like to, with that level of responsibility, with all of those service members? What is that experience like? What is that like for you?
Well, in many ways, it's no different from being an infantry squad leader. You're just responsible for more people. As an infantry squad leader in the Army or the Marine Corps, that non-commissioned officer has more responsibility than almost all of his or her peers in civilian life will ever have. So he or she is responsible for the lives of 9 people. And whether those people live or die, whether they eat, whether they get paid, whether they have clean socks, which is incredibly important if you're an infantryman. And that responsibility is multiplied as you rise in rank and as you become a leader of more soldiers. So I would say that the answer to your question about what's it like to be a commander, it's a huge responsibility, but there's nothing more rewarding. There's nothing more rewarding than leading American service members. And I used to say, when I assumed or relinquished command in my speech, I always said that there's no greater honor than to command American soldiers.
Wow.
Sir, it's fascinating. And I just on that note, and we're going to back up and talk about some of those highlights along the career. But, Robert just asked you about what it's like to command. I have to go to what it's like to hang it up. I mean, by the way, I usually do this in the beginning of the show. If you're just listening to this conversation, you could go on YouTube and you could actually watch the conversation. If you're watching, you could go to your favorite podcast platform and click subscribe. So there, I've got that plug out of the way. But if you're watching, you could see the flag. I can't see the stars on the flag in the background, but I have to assume that there's 2 stars back there and on that flag. So what was it like in 2014, taking off the uniform? And I know you continue to be back on post quite a bit these days for other reasons, which we'll talk about. But what was it like to relinquish that command for that final time? And after having that responsibility, as you said, starting as a platoon leader, as a second lieutenant, having 40, 50 guys under you, and then, that responsibility ending up as civil affairs and psychological operations to the quite literally, tens of thousands. It's enormous. And then the next day, you're just a regular Joe.
Yeah, it's to be honest with you, there was a void for a while. My entire adult life, I was a soldier, and make no mistake, in the reserve components, and there two reserve components in the Army National Guard and the Army Reserve. If you serve in one of those reserve components, you're still a soldier. And especially since 2001, I would say, when the Guard and Reserve, the operations tempo for the Guard and Reserve has just been astronomical. So there was a void, but it was probably a little bit different for me as an Army Reserve soldier than, say, one of my active component counterparts who retired, because I went back to my civilian job. Not that I ever left my civilian job, but now I didn't have anything, and now I didn't have the Army to compete with my civilian job. And what I found was that my civilian job by itself, without the Army, was just not enough to keep me interested.
Wow. I can imagine, sir. And also, I know that you're a published author. You have a book, The Future of the Citizen Soldier Force, Issues and Answers. And I wanted to know if you'd like to kind of talk about that and, what inspired you to write that book. Well,
the book's 25 years old, so it's kind of dated, but the reason I sought command in the Army Reserve, and in fact, the reason I stayed in the Army Reserve, was to effect change. And I was always, and when I was not a commander, I spent 3 years when I was in law school in the Army National Guard, and the rest, and then I transitioned over to the Army Reserve. And when I was not a commander, I was always frustrated because the Reserve and the Guard did things differently and they do things differently than the active Army does. And I believed then, and I still believe now, that was not right. And so I wanted to be in a position to implement my view of what I thought the Army Reserve should be. And so that's why I sought command.
It's fascinating. Fascinating background. I can only imagine, how that balancing act. I know as a young lieutenant, I know the balancing act that I have, and I can only imagine that as those responsibilities increase. And I was just talking to somebody literally just before coming on the pod. I'll say that again, the pod. It's funny. You get used to juggling multiple email accounts. You get used to the tempo of the texts. And I don't know, sir, if you had GroupMe, if that was a thing when before you retired, but right now, oh my gosh, there's so many different, depending what additional duties you have, all these GroupMes and these messages flying back and forth, and it's crazy. But certainly as your responsibilities increase, certainly it's never ending. So you graduated from West Point. You went into you became an infantry officer. What was your favorite assignment along the way? And you've held many. As you know, you and I have had many conversations. I've always been fascinated by the civil affairs world, and certainly that's the job that you retired from. But of everything you've done, the places you've been, the assignments you've had, what do you point to as number one?
I can't categorize any job I had as my favorite. Certainly, I've had some that I've enjoyed more than others. And certainly some were more fun than others. But there's no way to compare being the commanding general of a 2-star command with being a platoon leader. I will say that the crucible for any officer is company command. And that being a company commander prepared me for the rest of my career. Now, I was a company commander, took command in 1984. So I had less than 5 years in service when I, as a young captain, took command of a rifle company. And that experience has never left me, and I've always reached back for something I learned as a company commander in every subsequent assignment since then.
Yeah.
Fascinating. Well, you know, I always ask our guests this question, sir, about myself or a person like me. If you're a teenager, a 17-year-old, you're thinking about going into the service, you're not quite sure, you're not really thinking you're going to go to college, and that person comes to you for advice, and what kind of advice would you give to a young man or lady who is considering service but really is not sure?
I would say you can't go wrong. You cannot go wrong if you're 18 years old and you're a high school graduate or about to graduate high school, and you're looking for something to do to fill the gap, or because you don't have a clear path mapped out in your head, then you cannot go wrong joining the military. Just it's as a learning experience, it's without parallel. And I think both of you will back me up on this. You'll meet friends that you will keep for the rest of your lives. And to this day, my best friends are the ones I served in the Army with. So I would tell any young person or any not so young person who's in their 20s or even 30s and is looking for something different to do, think about the Army, the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Air Force, the Coast Guard, and now the Space Force as an option. And if you're going to go to college, it's a great way to help you pay for college, whether you go the ROTC route or the Service Academy route, or whether you serve as an enlisted soldier and then decide to get out and go to college.
Robert, just note that you said the Army first and Marine Corps was 2 or 3 later on that list. Just noting that.
Well, the Army is the oldest service.
The oldest, sir, all due respect, but the Marine Corps is our best.
Oh boy, we got into this again. There we go.
Well, we don't have enough time, I'm sure, to argue that one.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, General Jacobs, I am curious of your class from West Point, and you graduated in 1979. Where is your class now? Did anybody stay in quite as long as you? And are you still in touch? My class actually has 2 3-star generals who just retired. They're still on terminal leave. They're still on active duty, as a matter of fact. So the chief of engineers, the Lieutenant General Todd Semonite, who got some news coverage about the border wall. He's my West Point classmate, and Lieutenant General Wayne Hooper, who was our highest ranking African American classmate, just retired. We had 2 4-stars as well. Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, those relationships, and that ties into what you were saying a little bit ago, which is interesting. So, segueing over to the civil affairs, psychological operations piece, to our listeners that do not quite understand what that is, if you don't mind, sort of explaining that, because often, people associate the Army, the military in general, with it's all about those M4s that we carry. And you certainly went in as an infantry officer, and certainly people associate infantry with that. And then you end up winning the hearts and minds. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I'll talk about civil affairs. I can talk a little bit about psychological operations later if you want me to, but I was a civil affairs officer and not a PSYOPer, so I'm more familiar with civil affairs. Civil affairs soldiers provide the link between the commander they support and the civilian population within which they operate. There are civilians, no matter what kind of military operations you conduct, whether they're in a permissive environment, whether you go into, as I did, into Haiti or Bosnia, or whether they're in a kinetic environment, Afghanistan, there are civilians, and those civilians can affect the mission. And so it's the job of the civil affairs soldiers and civil affairs units to be the link between that civilian population and the commander, to provide the commander information on what the civilian population as necessary, and that sort of thing.
And if I may, why as an Army reservist, why are most of those units, people mostly think of active duty, they're the ones that are out there working full time. My understanding is, certainly you commanded the civil affairs and psychological operations. Why is that something that's being led on the reserve component side?
Well, there are active component civil affairs and psychological operations units. As a percentage of the psychological operations force, there's a much larger percentage in the active component than the percentage of the civil affairs force that's found in the active component. Something like 90% of the civil affairs force is in the Army Reserve. And by the way, the Marine Corps has civil affairs units as well. I think there are two major reasons for that. I'll give you the politically correct and the politically incorrect answer. The politically correct answer is that the civil affairs force traces its recent history back to military government units of World War II. So if you saw the movie Monuments Men, those guys were civil affairs guys. And in World War II, they recruited the military government soldiers directly from the civilian world and pinned rank on them commensurate with their experience. And they applied their civilian skills to their jobs as Army, mostly officers, administering military government in occupied Germany. The politically incorrect answer is that the Army is not large enough. The leadership of the Army does not see the importance of, does not think that civil affairs is important enough to create more force structure in the active Army. That's my personal opinion. That the Army won't agree with that.
Huh.
So I think there should be more civil affairs units in the active force. And in fact, there's one civil affairs brigade in the active Army. It belongs to U.S. Army Special Operations Command, and it's a special operations unit and supports special operations units. There's no civil affairs units in the active component that support the conventional force. Several years ago, the Army did create a conventional civil affairs brigade headquartered at Fort Hood in the active component, but they inactivated it a few years ago. So as has always been the case, the civil affairs units supporting the conventional force are in the Army Reserve, the great majority of them.
Nice. Well, sir, one of the awards that you received, or decorations, that you received over your career as a master parachutist. How does one become a master parachutist? I think that'd be interesting for our audience to find out. Well,
it's a badge, not a decoration. First, you have to become. There are three grades of the parachutist badge, which is awarded for static line parachuting. You have to graduate from the U.S. Army Airborne School at Fort Benning, Georgia. You make 5 jumps there.
Okay.
Pardon me?
I noticed you said it's the Army.
It is the U.S. Army Airborne School, and it trains parachutists from all the services. So you it's a 3-week course. I went as a cadet in 1977, and I'm a second generation paratrooper. I'm proud of that. My dad served in airborne units and in special forces. And so you earn the parachute badge by making your 5 qualifying jumps at jump school at Fort Benning. To earn the senior and master parachutist badges, you have to become a jump master. And there are a few jump master schools run by the Army. And I went to jump master school in 1980 at the 82nd Airborne Division Advanced Airborne School. And to become a senior and master parachutist, there are requirements like a number of jumps as a jump master, number of mass tactical jumps, number of combat equipment jumps, et cetera, et cetera. Wow. So the number I think for a senior parachutist is number of jumps, I believe, is 30. The number of jumps for a master parachutist is 65.
Wow. Amazing. So, I know that you're still very active, sir. You still have a lot of service in you, obviously. You served your country for a majority of your life, as you said yourself. So if you're looking at your career, you're looking at what you're doing now, what do you see yourself doing in, let's say, 5 to 10 years from now?
I don't know. Hopefully, if the pandemic will go away, I could become more active as the Army Reserve Ambassador for South Carolina. But we're kind of limited. We're kind of limited in what we can do with being stuck at home and being forced to do everything over the internet and telephone. So, but I don't know the answer to that. I'm enjoying not having a civilian job right now. If the right civilian job came along or that involved the right combination of service and challenge and reward and something I could be passionate about, I'd be all over it. But that hasn't popped up yet.
So, sir, what does a Army Reserve ambassador do?
The Army Reserve Ambassador is to the Army Reserve what the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army is to the let me back up. The Army Reserve Ambassador is to the Chief of the Army Reserve what the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army is to the Secretary of the Army. And the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, there are at least one in every state and territory, and in larger states there are more than one. They represent the Secretary of the Army in the civilian community. It's an unpaid position. I think it's a 3-star equivalent for the cost of the civilian aide to the Secretary of the Army, and they provide that presence in the community, the linkage with the movers and shakers in the civilian community and the local state government, et cetera. And the Army Reserve, and the intent of the Army Reserve Ambassador Program is that the Army Reserve Ambassadors do the same thing for the Army Reserve in the civilian community. We represent the Army Reserve. We tell the Army Reserve story. We're kind of unpaid public affairs folks for the Army Reserve with the local media, et cetera.
Excellent. And I know the Army Reserve Ambassador here in Illinois quite well and very actively involved in representing. And I can only imagine the challenges of being quarantined and not being able to be as involved. And I know that you certainly, I alluded to this earlier, continue to be active on Fort Jackson. I know you are you and I have said on a couple of Zoom calls together. You continue to be supportive of Jewish service members, and I just actually briefly want to touch on that. You achieved a high rank. I don't think you were the most senior Jewish officer in the Army, but certainly achieved a very high rank. What was that like? Because people ask me that all the time regarding, call it, I don't want to really go into that world of racism or anti-Semitism, but just, is there any prejudice that you've received at any point along your military journey?
I've never experienced any overt anti-Semitism. I have experienced the effects of ignorance about Jews and Judaism, and especially about Jewish life in the Army. And I will tell you that I think that I don't want to overgeneralize. So at the risk of doing that, I will tell you that I think that that level of ignorance has increased over the past 35, 40, 50 years. Because remember, I was a Jewish kid growing up in Army Jewish communities on Army posts. And there was a much greater understanding of the Jewish community within the Army when I was a kid and when I was a lieutenant than when I was a 1 and a 2-star general, 5, 6, 10 years ago. And I think that's unfortunate. I think part of that is societal and demographic, but not all of it.
Very interesting. Very, very interesting. And my final question is certainly, you've touched on this several times, sir, about being, balancing your civilian life and military life, and you served for many, many years in balancing those lives, either on the National Guard or the Army Reserve. And I know you certainly have quite a bit of active duty time from your deployments. But what was that like? You've had a successful career, but what was that like? And what's your advice to service members that might be listening, that either are considering joining or are currently in, and maybe either currently in the Reserve or Guard, or maybe they're active duty and thinking of making a change and trying to get their civilian life started? How did you manage to balance those careers? And what's your advice?
Yeah, you use the word balance, and that is exactly the right word. Those who have never served in the Guard or Reserve just simply can't understand the balance. Because if you're in the active component, you have to balance your job, which is being a soldier, sailor, airman, Marine, and your family. And oh, by the way, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marine Corps help you with that balance. They provide a lot of benefits for your family. And I'm not saying it's the same as having a 9-to-5 job in the civilian community by any means, because it's certainly not. But what that active soldier, sailor, airman, Marine cannot understand is having to throw that civilian job into the mix and having to balance that in addition to those other two things. Mm-hmm. And it's like a 3-legged stool. And those legs are all uneven. Sometimes the stool tips one way or the other. Sometimes it tips in the direction of the Army. You gotta leave the other two things aside for the time being so you can focus on the Army. Sometimes it tips in the balance in the balance of the family, and sometimes the balance tips in the direction of civilian job. So every individual has to figure out what that balance is. But I am firmly convinced that there is a way to balance all three if you have your head screwed on straight and you understand how the service works, and you can delegate and you make everybody responsible for their slice of the pie. Now, how did I do it? Frankly, I sacrificed some significant opportunities in my civilian career as my responsibilities in the Army increased as I advanced in rank, and I don't regret that at all. It's a choice I made. It's how I handled the balance.
Wow.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I would ask you now, sir, as you said, you don't have a civilian job to contend with. So my final question is, what is a day in the life of Jeff Jacobs look like? A regular day. What do you do, man? Are you on a golf course? Are you, when you're having downtime, that is?
Well, it looked different before you couldn't eat in restaurants and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But I never miss my workout. I never miss my PT now because I always got time for that. And I stay active with being the Jewish lay leader at Fort Jackson, and with my synagogue, and catching up on things that I didn't have a lot of time to do for the past dozen years or so, which is like reading. So my life is my day is whatever I want it to be when I wake up. I still manage to wake up pretty early, but my day is whatever I want it to be, and figuring out when I can get to the gym for my PT session.
Nice.
Well, thank you, sir, for coming on. Thank you for obviously your many, many years of service. And as we always say on the show, we all serve, and that continues beyond hanging up the uniform. And that's really the way we always end with and trying to encourage our listeners, whether you put on the uniform at any point in your life or you volunteer. Certainly in this age of COVID, there's always something to be done by volunteering, by getting involved, supporting causes. It doesn't always involve money. It can involve time. It certainly involves passion, and that's something that I know you, sir, have brought to the Army and continue to bring to veterans, to those that are currently serving, and the community at large. So thank you for that, and certainly to all of our listeners, get online, your favorite podcast platform. You can subscribe. We've got a great lineup in the coming weeks. I know we have retired Brigadier General Gary Prophet, formerly of Walmart. Great discussion with him. We've got Bo Higgins from Amazon. All these conversations coming up, and then those are all Robert. I hate to say it, all Army guys. But we also have my very, very, very dear friend for many years, John Dankowski, who retired from the Navy and spent many years working in the Clinton White House and Security Council, and great continuation from our conversation a couple of weeks ago with Richard Goldberg. So some fantastic guests in the past. You can download all of those, subscribe to what's upcoming. Don't miss an episode of We All Serve. Robert, any closing thoughts?
Thank you again, sir, for coming on and really sharing and giving insight on really what it's like to be an outstanding leader and just committed to service. Thank you for continuing your service. Thank you for all of your service. And it was a pleasure having you on.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And thank you for the wonderful things you do in telling our story.
Absolutely. And final question of you, sir. Are there any organizations or efforts that you would like to highlight?
There are too many worthy veteran service organizations out there who support veterans and organizations that support serving soldiers to single out any one, because there are just hundreds of them. So I would encourage your listeners to find one that's reputable and that they believe in, and support them with your checkbook.
There you go.
Nice.
Well, thank you very much. We all serve, and definitely tune in, and we'll continue these conversations. But that's a wrap on our episode with Major General retired Jeff Jacobs. Thanks for joining us. We all serve.
We all serve.